This video is about achieving self-realization. Self-realization's obstacle is not the ego itself, as you have heard many teachers say. The obstacle to self-realization is our identification with the ego. That is what keeps us in darkness and suffering in this life. It's the same as saying that our desires are the problem to enlightenment. The desires are not the problem because some desires are valid. It is our attitude towards the desires that is the problem. Our consciousness, before being recognized as our true nature, being pure and neutral, identifies with the ego, mind and body. So the obstacle is ignorance of our true nature and its identification with the ego. The remedy to ignorance is knowledge. We will have that knowledge that will burn the darkness of ignorance when we will know our consciousness and recognize it. In fact, we can experience and will know our true nature when we relax in meditation. In meditation, we will observe thoughts arising. To know our true nature as awareness and consciousness, we only need to simply ask, who is observing, that is, who is the witness of the thoughts arising? Note that the mind may try to answer the question with a thought, but note that the thought that answers the question, who is observing the thoughts, with, it is I, is also just a thought. We are the observers of all thoughts. The observer is our true self. It is just awareness observing everything, because all experiences or objects that appear are arising within our consciousness. Most of us believe we are the thoughts. However, the thoughts, the mind and the ego that is part of the mind are all just thoughts. For example, the ego is just a collection of memories and stories of who we are. The ego is a story of the idea of a self-recycling constantly in our minds. Only awareness can be aware of our conscious existence. The conscious witness that we really are is pure and neutral, and having being not recognized as ourselves, it simply identifies with the ego mind, believing to be the character that the ego tells with the stories of who we are. Of course, one may ask, why is it bad to identify with the ego story of the self we think we are? It is not only bad, but it actually wreaks havoc on our lives because the ego identifies with the body-mind complex. So again, one might question, what's wrong with identifying with the mind-body complex? After all, it is our mind and body. Well, there is a problem, and it is that both the mind and body are really unconscious. The body is completely on autopilot. The heart beats automatically, as is breathing, digesting, and other bodily functions. In addition, the body works on a chemical reward system of pleasure, based on dopamine seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. So, if we identify with the mind and the mind is left alone, it will engage in seeking pleasures in new experiences, forever chasing that dopamine high. As it is evident, the mind identifying with the body will eventually end in dopamine addictions. We want to avoid identification with the body because it is destructive. Actually, the so-called suffering comes from the body's dopamine addictions, the mind's beliefs and convictions, and the ego's distorted view of reality. Not only that, but if we identify with the mind, it will be hell on earth because the mind has a bias toward negative thinking. Actually, because the ego operates on desire, fear, and lack, that is, lack of, like I'm not enough or I don't have enough in a day, about 50,000 thoughts. About 80% of our thoughts are negative. The mind tries to protect us from unpleasant situations, but it backfires because in doing so, it only plays negative scenarios in our brains. It is not a good idea to identify with the mind, because our suffering comes from the body's dopamine addictions, the mind's irrational beliefs and convictions, and the ego's distorted view of reality based on desire, fear, and lack. It is a good system, makes our life functional, but it only positively functional when run by the witness awareness observing it and directing it. The ego is just thoughts. It is like the operating system of a computer. It's necessary for the computer to function, run programs, and interact with the user. However, the operating system isn't the computer itself. It's a software construct running on the hardware. Just as the operating system creates a user-friendly interface that allows us to interact with the complex underlying hardware, the ego creates a sense of self that allows us to navigate the complexities of life. The ego is useful and even necessary for day-to-day functioning, setting goals and managing relationships. However, the ego also veils our ability to see reality. Note that if we experience reality, we will become self-realized. If it was not for language, we would not identify with the ego, which consists of a narrative, a story of who we are. It is a story told in words, language. We have fallen in love with the thoughts that tell a story of who we are, so we have identified with the ego narrative, the story about who we are, but it is just a story of thoughts in our minds. As we have also discussed in other videos, the core of spiritual awakening or enlightenment is the recognition that our true nature is consciousness itself, rather than the limited ego self we typically identify with as our true nature. This understanding, if it becomes realized, it offers a profound shift in perspective of how we see the world. The outside world will not change. It will be us that we will have a completely different perspective and attitude toward the world. If the shift happens, we realize that freedom from suffering from egoic automatic behaviors, like constant reactivity to what we like or dislike, doesn't come from controlling or perfecting the ego. Self-realization occurs from recognizing that our more fundamental nature as the awareness in which all experiences, including the ego, arise and subside. Self-realization is the profound recognition of our true nature as pure awareness. This recognition fundamentally transforms our relationship with life and our own minds. After self-realization, the landscape of our experience shifts dramatically. So in this video, we will find out exactly how to be self-realized, what is the main obstacle, which of course is our identification with the ego, which veils our reality and keeps us in suffering and darkness. Nothing in the outside world will change. We will still get sick, get old, and eventually die. However, we will not care as much. It will not be as much suffering because the ego will not make life worse than it actually is with its fears, desires, and sense of lack. In that state of ego belief, we experience life in fears, desires, and limitations. We are suffering in bondage from ego attachments. We are immersed in the experiences that the ego entangles us in because we identify with the ego, its fears, desires, and limitations. That is the fundamental obstacle to self-realization, our identification with the ego. Not the ego itself, but identifying with the ego is what the main problem is in self-realization. Because all this suffering occurs from the ego's interpretation of our life experience. We will now analyze an experience to see how the ego interacts with the experience, so we can trace the path from object perception in our eyes and the transmission to our brain to the ego's distortion of reality. Then we will see how the ego's interpretation of the experience and the ego's claiming the perception to be its own experience happens, and we will finally discover our consciousness. The consciousness is the witness of all these events in the experience, because all of these events from the eye to the brain, the mind, and the ego are arising within consciousness or awareness. Before we begin, the term mind has to be defined as it differs from the brain. The brain is the physical organ inside the skull, composed of neurons and other cells. The mind is generally considered to be the result of brain activity, encompassing mental states and processes. The mind is our cognitive faculty and the result of the brain's electrical pulse activity. It is the set of cognitive faculties, including perception, thinking, judgment, memory, and language. So first, we need to understand how the mind processes the objects our eyes see. What happens is that light, either from a source like the sun or artificial lighting, falls on an object. The object reflects some of this light, and the reflected light from the object enters the eye. When reflected light from the object enters the eye does not actually see the object directly. What happens is that the eye collects the reflected light from the object and converts it into electrical signals, and then it sends it to the brain. Different areas of the brain then process various aspects of the perceived light from the object. So the eyes do not directly see the object, The eyes act more like sophisticated cameras, capturing light reflected from objects. Nor does the brain directly see the object as well. The brain just receives the light and integrates all this information received from the electrical light impulses to construct a cohesive image or perception of the object. What we perceive as seeing the object is actually the brain's interpretation of these electrical signals. The brain constructs our visual experience based on these signals and prior knowledge, experience. This means our perception of the world is not direct, but a construction or representation created by our brain. Our experience of the world is mediated by our sensory organs, like our eyes, brain, and the nervous system. We don't have direct access to reality, but rather only access to our brain's interpretation of the signals it receives and the images it creates in our brains. So we don't see the world out there. We see an image of the world in our brains. Each time we look at the world and its objects, the brain creates an image of it in our brains. As if that was not obscuring enough, then the ego, the narrative or story of who we are in our minds, appears and further obscures the image or interpretation with its own biases, fears, desires, and sense of lack. The ego gives us unsolicited suggestions and interpretations of what the perception of the object or the situation perceived means for the ego. Since we, the consciousness, identify with the ego and its constructs, convictions and biases, we take the ego's advice of what the experience means to us. At this point, you can understand that not only do we not directly experience the objects and world around us, but in addition, our ego distorts the perceptions further to create a projection of reality. The eye sees it, the brain decodes it, and the ego interprets it into a projection of what we see. That is why they call our perception of reality an illusion. It is not that something is not there. In our perception, objects or situations are there, but we get a distorted view of what it is really there. In the sense that our experience of reality is heavily filtered and interpreted by our minds, leading to a potentially distorted view of what's actually there. Nevertheless, we can see from this process that the experience goes through the eyes, the brain, the mind, and then the ego that is part of the mind. However, it is easy to see now that all these are objects that we are aware of. The eyes, the brain, the mind, and the ego are all within our awareness. What remains is that we are aware of the ego conceiving a biased reality for us. If we identify with ego, it takes us for a roller coaster. If we recognize our true nature as awareness, we become free. So freedom, friends. Freedom is the only way out of the darkness and ignorance. Created by Elias Stasinos. Hit the like button and subscribe if you found this enlightening.